Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the T&E Committee work session. Today, the T&E Committee will take up WSSC's FY23 spending control limits. The goal of the spending control limits is to reconcile Montgomery County and Prince George's County Council's actions by November 1st of each year so that WSSC Water can plan the approved limits and into their operating budget public hearing draft, which is released for public comment by January 15th each year. I want to thank Ms. Reed, all the commissioners, your great staff and all the executive staff for being here. Very much look forward to your presentation. Very grateful to Mr. Levchenko for his work with you and for the packet. And unless any of my colleagues want to make opening remarks, I'll turn it over to Mr. Levchenko.
All right, and I want to just briefly turn it over to Ms. Reed or any other folks from WSSC Water who'd like to make some opening remarks.
Well, good morning, President and council members. And Keith, thank you for turning the mic over to me so that I could introduce our illustrious team, beginning with our fabulous commissioners, our Vice Chair, Howie Dennis, and Eloise Foster, Commissioner Foster, Commissioner Fausto Bayonet, as well as my executive team, Joe Beach, Monica Johnson, and Jay Price, as well as our Chief Financial Officer, Patty Callahan, and her finance team. We are here today to answer any questions that you may have about our proposed 9% rate increase and to explain why we feel the need to have that level of an increase this coming year.
Okay. With that, what I'll do is I'm gonna share my screen and I think we can go expeditiously through the slides. And certainly if WSSC Water's folks want to chime in on a clarifying or factual point, please do so as we go through this. But this really echoes what's in the packet, so folks have seen this already. But I'm going to bring it up now. Sky, I need access to share my screen.
1 second.
Thanks.
Oh, Sky Brand. Just realized Sky Brand is a person. Okay.
Okay, I think I see it now. All right, can folks see this?
Yes.
Try to make it bigger if I can. Okay, so I'm just going to go through this fairly quickly. If folks have questions, please stop me. Tom had brought up some of this already in terms of the process, so I'll go quickly through that. Let's see. Yeah, quickly, just as Tom mentioned, the goal of this process is to come to agreement with Prince George's County or the Prince George's Council on spending control limits by November 1st. We've had a public hearing on September 28th. The Prince George's Council held a briefing last week on the 14th. So both councils have at least been initially exposed to this. We expect the Prince George's Council to come back with its recommendations on October 26th based on our discussions with staff there. And certainly between now and then, we will, depending on what the committee comes up with today, we'll continue to work with Prince George's to try to come to agreement, preferably by next week if we can, but if necessary, we can go another week. Let me bring that down. Just real quickly, the goals of the spending control limits process, and also I want to bring up the long-range financial plan, which the limits come from. Obviously, it's to continue to allow WSSC Water to provide high-quality service, cost-effective service, et cetera, within a framework of reasonable and stable rates. And that's why we do try to look at it in a multi-year context. To see what happens from year to year, and I'll get into that a little bit later. And then with regard to the long-range financial plan, WCC Water does have a number of financial metrics, just like the county does with its fiscal plans, to try to bring those metrics into the policy range that it needs, both in terms of best practices, but also in terms of providing a strong argument to the bond rating agencies, for example, to continue getting AAA bond rating. So it's very important in that context as well. And just a little background on spending control limits itself. There are 4 limits. These were established back in 1994 by resolution. And that's important. This is not state law. This is resolution by both councils. So it's a process that the 2 councils have worked within based on their own agreement. You have the maximum average rate increase. You also have a debt service and a new debt limit. And then you have a total water and sewer operating expenses limit. And it is important to note that the limits provide direction to WSSC as to how to build its budget, but it does not limit the councils later. In May of each year, when the councils meet to finalize their actions on the WSSC water budget, these limits do not impede the council either way. The council could go below the limits, it could go above the limits. It's intended to provide once again, the structure for WSSC Water going forward with its request. And one key reason for that is what is in state law is a default budget provision that notes that if the 2 councils do not come to agreement in May, then the default budget that is approved is the proposed budget for that year. Not the approved budget going forward, but the proposed budget for that upcoming year. And that's why it's important that both councils are comfortable that the proposed budget is coming in within reason. You know, and it's within the threshold of where the councils want to start its discussion, at least. Generally, the process has worked well over the past 20 years. There are some years where the councils have not agreed on limits, but even in those years, the limits still provide guidance to WSSC Water. For instance, if there are 2 different maximum average rate increase ceilings, typically WSSC Water would not be above the highest of the 2, and is typically between or a little bit lower, and typically above the lowest but below the highest. So it still provides that guidance even in a worst case where they don't come to agreement. And just I don't know how easy it is to see this chart. This just actually shows the approved limits dating back, to FY96 all the way back. And you can see the approved limits, and you can also see the actual rate increases that were approved. And this is important to note just because the limits themselves are not necessarily de facto what's approved by the councils. In a number of cases, we've had the actual budget come in with a lower rate increase. The other thing to note of particular interest is we had a number of years with 0% rate increase from FY99 through FY04. And that was around the time that WSSC Water was going through what's called its competitive action program. There was a substantial revisiting of its base budget. And there was a substantial reduction in staffing at the time. About 1/3 of its workforce was reduced. So there were a lot of budgetary cuts. And that also meant that the rate increases were also, or in this case, no rate increase, were possible for some years. However, after that, we started to see the rate increases pop up again as a couple things. One, the capital improvements program was increased to catch up on some infrastructure concerns. And then also some of the elements that were reduced during the earlier part of these 0% rate increases, some of those items later did come back. So that's the early history. And then more recently, you can see the rate increases over the past 5 or 6 years from the last 2 councils. They've generally been above inflation. And we'll talk about some of the pressures there in some of the next slides.
Mr. Levchenko, I just want to interrupt. Councilmember Reamer is in the waiting room, so whoever's administrating the Zoom, if we could let him in.
Thank you. I've just been let in. Thank you. I'm going to be audio only for the next 20 minutes or so.
Okay, and I do have some slides I'm going over. Hans, do you have visual? Can you see?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So in terms of what we call the base case scenario, this is what WSSC Water staff put together based on its best assumptions going forward. This is still very early in the budget process, but we need to have some kind of snapshot of revenues and expenditures and trends and so forth to build what's called a base case. And then it does get revised, as you see the word revised here, as additional information comes up. But I did want to go over the major assumptions. I'm going to go through this very quickly. First, and this is new for this year, you may recall that in past years, WSSC Water has had rate increases, and then it has its fixed fees, and the fixed fees have remained unchanged. We made some significant changes to them about 5 or 6 years ago to the account maintenance fee, and then we created the infrastructure renewal fee. But since then, they have remained the same. Not only are they fixed in terms of what people pay, the actual fee schedule for them has been fixed for the last 5 years. This year, WSSC Water is recommending that the fixed fees go up by the same rate as the volumetric fees. And this is not uncommon in the utility industry to do that. And we can talk about the implications of that going forward. Also, wanted to note that there are significant decreases in what we call funds available. I'll get into that in a minute. Unlike, say, the county government's property tax revenue and income tax revenue, which even in bad years tend to increase some, with WSSC Water, we're seeing decreases in their most significant revenue source, their volumetric rate revenue. And also some other elements in that. And I can get into that in a little bit. And then also, in order to meet its financial metrics, and we can talk about those later, WSSC Water is assuming in this base case to increase its cash balance reserves. And that's in order to try to get closer to its cash on hand metric and also its debt service coverage. And we can talk more about those if there's more interest in that. On the expenditure side, these are fairly typical assumptions we see from year to year in this process. This year, WSSC Water is assuming some compensation adjustments for its employees. Actually, in the last year, maybe 2 years, it's had much more constrained increases for its employees than county government has. And this year, it's at least for the starting point, assuming a more traditional merit and COLA approach for its eligible staff. So there is an increase built in for that. And then in its current programs, it's assuming a 2% inflationary increase, which is similar to last year's forecast. It also has regional sewage disposal costs it has to pay to DC Water. It's assuming a 2% increase in that. And then in terms of new and additional reinstated programs, these are issues that come up from year to year, areas that they're not doing now but feel are important, or perhaps in some cases related to the capital improvements program. For instance, the Piscataway Bioenergy Facility will be opening. New and additional programs like that are not assumed in the base case. So they would have to be absorbed in the above numbers. So to the degree those are funded, something else would have to be removed. Now, I wanted to get back to the funds available briefly. I had mentioned that the rate revenue was down. This chart, it may be a little hard to see, but if rates were unchanged in FY23, WSSC estimates that its rate revenue would go down about $10 million. So right off the top, that equates to about a 1.3% rate increase. And then in addition to that, there's an uncollectible reduction shown here. This relates to the pandemic experience that WCC has had with its accounts and its substantial increase in its revenue collection and unpaid bills. So for the first time, we're seeing essentially a write-off here, or an assumed amount that will not be collected. And they're showing $6 million. So combined, those two elements with some of the other more modest adjustments get you pretty close to about a 2% rate increase. And then you have some other adjustments in revenues going forward. The reconstruction debt service offset, it's sort of a wonky financial issue, but the revenue from that the fund balance in that account is declining. And so these numbers are being phased out over the next couple of years. And so the revenue from that is down a couple $1 million. So overall, you have about $17.4 million in reduced funds available. And that's about a 2.2% impact on rates. And we haven't gotten to expenditures yet. So that's just sort of the first element I wanted to mention. And then this just talks about what I just mentioned. On the expenditure side, as we talked about, they try to develop what might be called sort of a same services type of budget, doing what you're doing now next year. I mentioned the salary and wage increases. They have heat, light, and power costs that they have to assume some increase there based on current trends. So these kinds of elements. Another key element is debt service, of course. It's a very significant portion of the operating budget. And for starting out this fall, as is typical, WCC Water assumes the debt service needed to support its proposed CIP. Now, of course, neither council has reviewed the CIP yet. They'll be doing that in February and March or spring of next year. To the degree there are changes up or down in that, then the debt service can be revisited as part of the operating discussion next year. But as a starting point, it's really the best place to start. We don't really have better information at this point. So the results of all of that, between the revenue gap and the expenditures and the need for additional reserves I mentioned for the financial metrics, you have about a $70.2 million gap to fill. And roughly it's about $7.8 million in revenue one gets from each 1% on the rate. So that 70.2 million divided by the 7.8 gets you about a 9% rate increase requirement. And then the water and sewer operating expenses are up based on those changes I mentioned before. And then the new debt and the debt service, as I mentioned, relate to the proposed CIP. Now, one glimmer of good news in this is that over time, the long-range financial plan does assume a gradual decline in the rate increase requirement. For instance, with some of the increase in the cash reserves, that's a one-time hit on the rate. So that would go down over time. So as you build up some of those metrics, once they get to the policy level, then you don't have to keep funding them. You can just maintain them. So that helps with the out years. And so you see you still have a significant rate increase requirement assumed in the financial plan next year, but then it starts to decline significantly in 25, and then 26 through 28, it's down to about a 4% increase. Now, of course, this is a snapshot. Even this year is uncertain, obviously, with all of the assumptions built into this. So the out years are even more uncertain, but it's the best snapshot we have at this time. In terms of looking at the rate increase, in terms of what's causing it, as all the elements I talked about earlier, the three biggest elements are the changes in funds available that I mentioned, the reduction in revenue, the operating reserve contribution to meet those financial metrics, and debt service. Those three account for about 75% of that rate of the rate increase requirement in the base case. And then you have a lot of these other elements I talked about, the expenditure side of things, the non-debt service expenditure side, filling up the last quarter of that. And then just to summarize, the 9% rate increase, what it does is it addresses the flat water consumption and declining water revenue. It It addresses the requirements in the CIP with regard to debt service, as well as PAYGO. There are assumed increases in PAYGO to keep debt service at a manageable level. The cash balance reserve would be increased. This is an important issue given, and as I noted in the packet, although WSSC Water got a AAA bond rating from 3 rating agencies, one of the rating agencies, Fitch, did give WSSC Water a negative outlook related to its debt service coverage. It's a slightly different metric, but the WSSC can talk about, but that's of concern. The overall operating expenses under the 9% increase would go up about 4.3%, but a portion of that is debt service. If you take the debt service out, then you're looking at operating expenses going up about 3.2%. And then it does assume that WSSC Water would find savings within its budget for any additional programs that or expansions to programs that it is seeking. It would have to find resources within the budget to do that. And as you could expect with WSSC, which is basically an industrial entity, a lot of its costs, at least in the short run, do tend to be fixed. Debt service, obviously, just like with county government, it's hard to turn that ship around quickly. Regional sewage disposal is a bill we have to pay to DC Water. Heat, light, and power is a significant element within the budget as well. And then a number of other mandated items that it has to deal with. The SSO consent decree and other elements and other regulatory and emergency requirements. So it presents a short-term challenge for WSSC in terms of finding available dollars. And then this final chart here, in terms of scenarios going forward, this tries to put together sort of everything you saw before. It shows the rate increase requirement at funding different elements. It shows what we call unspecified reductions would need to be in order to meet a lower rate increase. So for instance, if you drop from the 9% to 7%, then you have about a $15.6 million gap that would have to be addressed. And that would have to be addressed through expenditure cuts or reduction in the operating reserve contribution that I mentioned earlier, or other changes in some of the base case assumptions. You know, it is early in the process. Some of those assumptions could change over the next few months. And then I also show what the impact would be on WSSC's operating expenses, both with debt service and without debt service. And for instance, at the 7% level, that would be about a 2.5% increase in its operating expenses overall, but it's basically a flat level for the non-debt service related expenses. So that's sort of how you read this chart. And that's it for the slides. What I did want to note, and what I did send out to council members and to participants yesterday, was we did receive from the county executive a memorandum with his recommendation. He's recommending a 7% rate increase ceiling. And I think now would be a good time to hear from executive staff regarding the executive's recommendation. So they can at least provide that context for us before we sort of open things up. So if Mr. Shofar or Raphael wants to talk about the executive recommendation, I think that now would be a good time.
Good morning, council members, WSSC Water staff. To look at the 7% recommendation, this is really a balance of what we saw as a difficult situation for WSSC Water, given the revenue challenges that they've had, given the loss in revenue between the different tiers, many customers being unable to pay their bills during the pandemic, and then just continuing to increase costs between customer affordability. So it should be noted that WSSC did suspend shutoffs and late fees before they were required to do so, and they did extend that practice after their requirement was lifted. So they have done a lot for customers within Montgomery County who struggled financially during the pandemic. But a 9% rate increase was seen as too much for the customers, and 7% is more of a middle ground. We also want to note that WSSC Water has not received any federal, state, or county assistance that have been able to support them during the pandemic, unlike the county has. So that was the overall goal of reaching the 7%, is finding a middle ground between the needs of WSSC and the needs of our customers or the county residents. Thank you.
And I also did want to update the committee on where the Prince George's Council is at this point. While the council itself has not put forth a recommendation on the limits, the Prince George's Council staff at last week's meeting had presented its recommendation of a 7% rate increase as well. So that's sort of where things stand at the moment. We have a Prince George's Council staff recommendation. We have a county exec, or our own county executive's recommendation at this point. And so with that, I'll turn it over back to you, Mr. Hucker, to see how you want to proceed with the discussion.
Sure. Thanks, Keith, and everyone. Raphael, let me just ask you a couple. What was the analysis that went? I was glad we received the county exec's recommendation. It would have been good to have it on time for the previous council session, so we didn't have to committee session, so we didn't have to reschedule things. What was? Can you explain your analysis that went into that? How did you arrive at 7?
Sure, and Keith covered the major points in his packet discussion. If you look at the breakdown of the rate increase, 2.5% is for debt service, and that is WSSC Water catching up with a lot of deferred CIP programs that they weren't able to cover during the height of the pandemic. And so a lot of those critical infrastructure projects have been delayed and have been pushed back in the CIP. So that's one chunk of it. Keith also.
So what are the expenditure reductions that you're envisioning?
Well, they've presented the 15.6 million of unspecified expenditure reductions. So WSSC has not detailed those yet. And that would come out during the main budget process. So, but then the other 2% for revenue increase, for revenue losses, is not something WSSC has much control over. And then also putting more money into their cash reserves for the to meet rating agency targets is a key factor, because if their rating goes down, then customers in Montgomery County residents are going to be paying more later on.
We all understand that. Yes.
So if you combine those three things, that's 6.8%, roughly the 7%. So that was the idea of reducing farther than that would just not be tenable for WSSC1.
Right. So without any further detail, how do you know you're comfortable with the unspecified expenditure reductions?
Well, over the last few years, WSSC Water has been able to sustain much larger reductions than that.
Right.
So
that's correct.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
President Hucker?
Yeah, Ms. Reed.
Yes, I'd also like to add that in addition to the unspecified reductions, we have several new things that are coming online, like the lead and copper rule, which we're going to have to respond to. Staffing for our bioenergy facility at Piscataway, as well as dam inspection and our tank painting, which is not for aesthetic reasons, but for maintenance reasons. And that's at least another $5 million on top of the $15 million that Raphael mentioned that we're going to have to make up.
No, that's a good point.
Mm-hmm. And those aren't things that we can get around. Lead and copper rule is going to, is a regulatory mandate, and all those other things are things that, are really critically important to our operation, to our citizens and customers. And President Hucker, if you would just allow me one other, I want to just emphasize how we got here. I mean, we really were empathetic and sympathetic to our customers, realizing that water is the first line of defense in the pandemic. We wanted to make sure we weren't turning off our customers, that we waived late fees. We didn't charge any late fees. And we got to the place where we have $130 million in revenue loss. And that's compounded by another thing that's been mentioned, but I want to emphasize, and that is that we have not received any state funding, any federal funding, and no funding from the counties to cover this. So it's, I would say we're between a rock and a hard place to continue to make sure we deliver the services that you're expecting us to deliver. And I'll be quiet now. I just
No,
need
I appreciate that. I know you are between a rock and a hard place, and I think we all appreciate everything you've done for customers that were suffering during the pandemic and the recession, and including waiving the late fees. And I think that's a very good point about new federal mandates, including the updated lead and copper rule. That makes a lot of sense. If IT could let me back in the, I'm also in the waiting room on my ailing laptop, so I could switch off my phone. That would be great. Can I ask Ms. Reed or Mr. Beach or whomever a couple additional questions? I'm very glad to see the proposed salary increase. Sorry, permit me to switch here. That'll be better. Thank you. Now I can see all the documents in one place. So I'm glad to see the salary increase for the meter readers, for example, which make around $30,000 a year. Is that across the board? Does that include all the management as well? Are they envisioned to get a 4.5% rating salary increase?
Councilmember Hucker, what we have in the budget right now for compensation increases is what we call a marker. Because right now
I'm sorry, my volume was down. Could you start again?
Oh, okay. All right. So
My
the amount.
switch over. I'm IT challenged today.
All right. Can you hear me now?
I can. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So the amount we have in the budget for the compensation increases is a marker. It's an allocation. We're very aware that for the last 2 years, none of our employees have had COLAs or merits or pay for performance at all. So we're just beginning negotiations with ASCME on that. And so what the final package looks like, what's the pass through,
Right.
that remains to be seen. Typically, we do pass through most of those improvements to unrepresented. I expect that we would do it this year, but obviously we're right at the beginning of the budget process.
Right. So it's the ceiling, but right now you're envisioning 4.5% increases for all the management as well. When you say unrepresented, just for the value of the public here.
What I would say is there would be increases for management as well as union and non-union rank and file.
I appreciated very much Chairman Al Carr sending over the benchmarking study from DLS, and I had a couple questions for you all from that. That compared WSSC to City of Rockville, City of Bowie, DC Water, and Fairfax Water and Sewer. I was interested, I know delinquent accounts, as long as I've been working with WSSC, have always been a real problem and a big challenge. How does Fairfax deal with those so differently? They have 7,785 delinquent accounts, and WSSC has over 90,000, 12 or so times more than that.
That's something we would have to discuss specifically with Fairfax. I think one of the reasons that we do not have, that we have high delinquency rate is because our enforcement process is not very strong. The late fees are the first, the shutoffs would be the next level of enforcement, but we have so many accounts, so many customers, it's difficult to reach them quickly like that. For instance, Baltimore City used to have a lien process that helped their collections. They don't have that any longer. The county, for instance, has the property tax lien process. That's why the collection rate for property taxes is typically over 99%. So it's not as strong, and we don't shut off a customer lightly, certainly not now. Before there's a shut off, even after we resume them in August for commercial and mid-September for residential, we do extensive outreach with the customers first.
Sure.
To do that. So
I appreciate that. Do you are you saying you don't know how Fairfax approaches this differently or how DC Water approaches this differently? Because DC obviously has probably even more low-income customers, you got to imagine, than Montgomery County, or a similar number. But they have both fewer staff, but also only 14,000 delinquent customers, and you all have 90,000.
Yeah, I can say for DC Water, first of all, their customer base is very different than WSSC Water. They have a larger portion of their customer base are non-residential, both commercial and government accounts, and also a very large part of it is wholesale customers like Montgomery, like WSSC Water. The second thing is DC Water has had very high rate increases the past several years. And if you look at Mr. Levchenko's packet that shows how high they've been, their cash position right now is they have about 365 days worth of cash in their reserves. So they've been in a place.
Right, we saw that.
First of all, their revenue reductions have not been as severe as ours, and they've had the resources to have more robust customer affordability programs than we are.
Okay, right. I mean, we all remember WSSC has had very high rate increases as well for a number of years now.
Or the DC Waters, but yeah.
Okay, well, much over the rate of inflation, but okay. And then also about, do you know why, I mean, WSSC, I had never seen this before, twice as many employees as Fairfax and much higher than DC Water as well.
Well, Carla, go ahead.
Our system is much bigger, twice as big as Fairfax, and also Fairfax just does water. We do water and wastewater.
Combined, it has the staff for combined water and wastewater for Fairfax.
We're still bigger, much bigger than they are, and they're much newer. And so that makes a big difference in terms of the maintenance that's required in a newer system versus an older system.
Yeah, the cost structure for Fairfax is very different. I think their square mileage of their service area is less than 500 square miles. Ours is about 1,000 square miles. We have more than twice as many accounts, and we're an aging system as well. We were founded in 1918. Fairfax Water, I believe, was begun in the 50s, and their average age of their pipes is much newer than WSSC Water.
Can I ask about federal and state dollars? You all, there's a lot of money for lobbying in the DLS report. How I know an awful lot of money was available from the federal government for water utilities. Why has WSSC not taken advantage of any of that?
We have tried to. I'll defer to Monica Johnson, our Deputy General Manager for Strategy and Partnerships, to talk about that.
Thank you. So most of the money coming out of the federal government is going to the states, the states and the counties. And WSSC is not a state, it's not a county. So we depend on sort of that money come as a pass through to us. We have to work with the state and county. It's not direct aid to us.
Okay, I thought there was money set aside in the federal acts for water utilities passed through the state. So maybe I should rephrase, why aren't you getting anything federal funds passed through from the state? You are a state created agency after all, and we're in this uncomfortable position of setting rates for a state created agency that's created in state law.
Because the money is not coming directly to us. We have to then ask the state, we ask the county, we have to ask other entities for the money. So it's not. How
much have you asked the state for?
So I don't have the specific numbers, but we have been working tirelessly to obtain funding.
And
but we can get back to you.
And Monica, I'd add to that Chair Calvin Hawkins in Prince George's County, in addition to the requests that we made to the counties directly, he also wrote a letter of support to the state to try to solicit some funds for us. And we still are in the process of lobbying and have not received anything, even though that extra vote of support was given.
And one other thing I would add to that is that the only customer assistance funds that we're aware of for the federal government is for the Low Income Household Water Assistance Program, LIWAP. The state, I believe, has an allocation of about 14 million statewide. And so the state has had their plan for distribution of that approved by the federal government. We believe they're going to implement that in January, February, and we are already working on making sure we get sort of the maximum allocation of that for our customers. But 14 million against our total delinquent amount and statewide, there's really not going to be a lot available for WSSC Water customers. And as Ms. Johnson said, we have been working very hard right from the start of the pandemic for federal and state aid. And unfortunately, we haven't received any. And we've had to face this pandemic, the same conditions the counties had to deal with to deliver services. We've had to do it alone, all on our own, and sort of trying to offset these revenue reductions with expenditure cuts. And we've been successful, but you can't sustain that level of reductions to a water utility indefinitely. Our mission is too important, too critical to take chances like that.
I'm sorry, everybody. My laptop has a new behavior where even plugged in while I'm on Zoom, it drains. I think I need a new battery. So if our IT staff could try to address that, that would be great. I was asking Joe or Ms. Johnson, thank you for that answer. I appreciate the position you're in. If the state received federal funds for water utilities, what's the status of them providing it to you all rather than just our ratepayers? Why would we want it to stay in the state bank account instead of in your bank account? I'd rather see it there.
We would rather see the money in our bank account as well. We're on the same page. We're in complete agreement with that.
But I don't think that's consistent with the plan that the state has submitted to the federal government. It would be distributed solely by the state. I believe it's the Office of Home Energy Programs. Monica?
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right, how much did the state receive for water utilities I'm sorry, the state from the federal government? How much did they receive for water utilities?
So I believe what was it? It's 17 million that will be split.
I believe it's about 14 million that will be allocated statewide. So for customer financial assistance, the only amount we're aware of is 14 million. I believe, though, that earlier the state had made an allocation of over 80 million for energy utilities for BG&E, Pepco, and others in the state, for-profit institutions for their customer financial assistance. We didn't receive any of that.
That's surprising. I mean, I keep reading about all the federal money that's available for water utilities all over the country. Is there anybody here from our Office of Intergovernmental Relations?
I don't believe we have anyone on the call today. We can certainly pass that on to them. I think one of the issues that was mentioned earlier is a lot of these utilities are governmental entities elsewhere in the country, and so these funds are available to be used for that purpose, but they are going to these state or local entities that are also the water utility. Whereas in WSSC Water's case, they would have to get it from the state or the county.
Right, and they're essentially a state agency. They're created by the state, as you know.
I mean, certainly, the Montgomery County government could have considered forwarding resources to WSSC, but of course, we had our own issues to deal with.
But WSSC, as you know, Keith, is a state agency. So the state has primary responsibility here. And if the state, which has a $2.5 billion surplus, has federal funds for water utilities that it's not providing to WSSC, it should be doing that. And I'm sort of surprised we don't have anybody from Intergovernmental Relations here or representing our state delegation. But it would be good to involve them in this conversation so that Montgomery County ratepayers aren't just the only pocket that we're draining.
We completely agree. Yeah, we completely agree with you. We're aware of the state surplus, and we are working actually with the Intergovernmental Relations Office, with our own Intergovernmental Relations Office, to lobby the state for an allocation out of that surplus. And we're going to be doing that very aggressively.
How much are you asking for?
We have delinquencies of about 60 million. it'll be a realistic and I would say aggressive ask of the state.
Okay, well, it would be great to have that question resolved and to have, I mean, we should have the chairs of our delegation here, fighting for this for you. They're the ones who created WSSC in the first place. And it shouldn't just be sitting in the state coffers as they were sitting on $1 billion in the rainy day fund for very many months before we had a statewide campaign to get the governor to put that on the street as it was intended. All right, well, those are my main questions. Colleagues, just please jump in because I haven't seen text from you and I can't see everybody on my phone here.
Sure. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I know we've been having technical difficulties, so appreciate everybody staying in this conversation. And I appreciate the comments and questions that you've asked. Definitely a tangled web across the state and across various jurisdictions. And we're trying to unsort that now to figure out how our ratepayers and residents can continue getting clean and safe water and have the infrastructure that we need, not only for now, but with the climate resiliency I know that we need moving forward, which I want to get to in a second. But let me ask regarding the salaries and the costs over this last year, particularly the last 18 months. Was there any hazard pay or elevated pay for any of the employees during this time?
The only amount that we were able to allocate for our employees because of our constrained fiscal situation is we did a one-time lump sum amount of $1,250 to employees who reported at their usual work site for at least 50% of the time during the pandemic. Okay,
well, very modest in terms of many other compensation arrangements that have been provided, especially here in the county. And of course, to underscore that, the elevated pay rates that we allowed for here in the county was offset by federal funding, going back to the point that was previously made by the chair and council president. So appreciate you sharing that with us. I'm just looking at some of the notes that have been taken while you all have been talking. I mentioned the climate resiliency and don't know if it gets muddled between this and CIP as well, but curious to know how the efforts that we need to continue moving forward and making sure that we have the safe and reliable drinking water, especially with the increased flooding and water problems and aging sewer system. How does this budget, the budget that you've presented and the various rates that have been suggested, what is the interplay between that and any of our work that needs to move forward regarding climate resiliency and climate change?
Okay, a bit on that. Okay, so for about 6 years ago, we initiated a climate change adaptation resiliency study. And we looked over what the projected increase in rainfall as well, and the increase in the impact of that to our riverine and coastal facilities. And so we went through a pretty rigorous process to identify which of our facilities were at risk because of that, and what assets within those facilities we would need to remediate in order to protect it from the rising river and coastal waters that we are anticipating. So there's funding in the CIP right now, I believe, to make those changes. The report, and we're working with our engineering and construction department to have those remediation measures implemented in the coming year or so.
And so I appreciate that. And just again, in this tangled web, just want to make sure that the work that you just referenced is part of the CIP and it's not part of this conversation.
Well, the debt service for our CIP is part of the spending affordability budget. So indirectly, it's not, but it would be separate. It's separate budgetarily, but yes, of course, it's all one budget.
That's right, and it is a tangled web, right? Overarching Mr. Lubchenko, I see you were about to chime in.
Yeah, well, a couple other elements related to this. They do have a longstanding energy conservation program that they've had in place for many years to basically retrofit their facilities. WSSC Water is a very high energy intensive entity. So there are a lot of cost-effective retrofits you can do, and they've been doing that for a decade now. So that's certainly part of this. And, you know, we're looking at retrofits of buildings as a major element of, you know, the county's climate action going forward. Also, their Piscataway bioenergy facility would generate a substantial amount of clean energy. So that helps their energy footprint, if you will. And they also do have a wind power purchase agreement that they've had in place for a number of years. So these are all elements that they've been discussed at the council in the context of what all the agencies are doing. And every agency has its own unique profile that it has to deal with. WSSC is very different from the schools, very different from, the college. But I think it's got a very good track record with regard to clean energy and energy conservation as well, which is a major element of the climate action process going forward.
Right. Did someone else want to weigh in? I'm sorry, Mr. Beach. No.
I would just say Keith is right. He's directly on point with that. And all of those measures and for energy conservation are part of our 20-year greenhouse gas reduction program, which we update every year. And we recently created a new division within our General Services Department for sustainability. And they're sort of working throughout the commission to implement these measures as well. One thing I did want to mention is our general manager, Carla Reed, did have to leave the meeting. She had a previous commitment in Annapolis that she had to get to. So I apologize for that.
Sure. I had commissioned an Office of Legislative Oversight report on how our climate is changing and what we need to do to mitigate that, and we're going to be having a subsequent T&E session, in the coming weeks to talk about that, and our infrastructure and mitigating climate change, particularly with WSSC, is an important component of that. So I won't dwell much more on it, but wanted to understand that again, that interplay with regard to this budget. And the bottom line for me, 9% I think was too high for our ratepayers, and the 7% clearly is moving in the right direction. And I still think that is high, but the conversation that we've had today helping illuminate to everybody that WSSC, unlike many other aspects of life, and especially government life, has not received the types of federal or even state support that others have used to stem, not only inflation, but other costs over the last 18 months. I still think 7% would be a shock to some residents and ratepayers. And so I'm open to figuring out how we soften that a little bit, but I certainly understand the rationale that you have for it, and also appreciate the comments and questions that the chair offered to get our state delegation in Annapolis to help ease the burden that was created by state legislation decades ago. So with that, I yield back to you, Mr. Chair.
Just one clarification on the customer impact, Mr. Hucker, sorry. The packet does note the impact on the average residential customer at each of the rate at a rate increase level. So for every 1% rate increase, an average residential customer will see about an 80-cent impact on their bill. At 9%, that equates to about $7.22. 7% would be $5.63. The one caveat is that includes fixed fees going up. So the customers that are in the customer assistance program don't pay the fixed fees. So they would also not pay a fixed fee increase. So they would see a slightly lower increase than the average residential customer that's not in the assistance program. And that's on page 7 of the packet, if you want to look at that chart. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilmember Glass. Those are really helpful comments. I want everybody from WSSC to understand we know you're in a very difficult position, and I want you to appreciate we're in a very difficult position as well. I think all of us know that you have debt service, and just as the county does, that you have to pay whether you like it or not. We received a warning letter from a rating agency as well, and we retained our AAA bond rating. We know what that feels like, and we know you want to address that, and we want you to address that. And we know you have fixed costs, many of them going up outside of debt service, not to mention your infrastructure, but things like the utility increases that were mentioned. Now, let me just point out the obvious. We're in the middle of a historic recession still. Statistically, the worst since the Great Depression. It has lasted longer than everybody predicted because the pandemic has gone longer with the variant. And the economy is still not reopened. I'm certainly hopeful that as the economy reopens, you're going to see you've been through the worst, and you are going to see a resurgence of collection from your commercial customers as people return to the office and that water use resumes to where it was before. But we are still in the county seeing lines for food relief, sometimes that are a mile long. At some of our churches on the weekend, we still have 6% unemployment, and countywide, twice as high as it was pre-recession. And we have, as you know, at least two different Montgomery counties. In parts of my district, the unemployment rate pre-COVID was 3 times the county average, and right now, would be 3 or 4 times the 6% in Longrange or East County or places like that. I fear that with too high, I realize that one of the drivers of your costs increase is all the delinquent accounts. But I think, if we allow you to raise them too much, you're creating even more delinquent accounts because we have so many customers that are hanging on by a thread. And I want you to realize since you probably don't follow every council session like we do, we have in other policy areas passed a savings program for every county agency this year. We have passed and then extended a fair holiday for all our ride-on customers. Now we have data about who they are, and a huge percentage of them are making $30,000 or less a year. So we are offering free bus service to them. Those are the same ratepayers that are struggling to pay their WSSC bill. We also have capped rents at 1.6%, not just for newer buildings or for big management companies that maybe have cash reserves to absorb that, but even for small landlords with 1 unit or 2 units, even for retirees with 1 unit, even for landlords that are having a lot of trouble with the same kind of increased utility costs and aging infrastructure that you're dealing with. We've told all the landlords in the county, even lots of retirees on fixed incomes, they can't raise rents more than 1.6%. So in that context, free bus service, savings plan for county agencies, 1.6% for landlords. It's difficult for me, and we've heard from so many tenant groups, CASA, JUFJ, Renters Alliance, that we are still flirting with a tsunami of evictions, which we want to avoid. And obviously a 9% rate increase would only exacerbate the risk of that. So to me, in that context, it's hard to justify certainly the 9%. I believe it's hard to justify even the 6% because that's almost 4 times what we're allowing landlords to raise. And water utilities, unlike rents, affect everybody in the county, homeowners as well, low income homeowners as well, and commercial customers and small businesses. So to me, I'd be more comfortable with 5% or 6%. We're preliminary. We're at a preliminary stage in the process. We have unanswered questions. I'd like to know the answer to what Fairfax does and DC does to address its delinquent accounts and why they have so many fewer than WSSC. And I very much think this committee and the whole council should write to the delegation. We can call them in, but we certainly should write to the delegation and the governor, urging them to meet their responsibility and make sure every penny of federal aid passed through the state for water utilities is going where it's supposed to go, to WSSC and its sister agencies. That's the first place we ought to start. The state, as I've said many times, has the primary responsibility for schools, childcare, healthcare, mental health, and we have a culture, I think, where we go to Montgomery County taxpayers and ratepayers first. And this is a clear case when there's so much federal money being spent, we're only doing the right thing by our ratepayers to make sure it's ending up in the right place. I know we're on the same page on that. So I would need to hear from Mr. Reamer too, but I would be comfortable moving 5.5 or 6%. And then we can always revisit this as we get closer to the budget. Councilmember Reamer.
Thank you. First of all, I want to say I appreciate your questions. Yesterday at the full council, or was it 2 days ago, you asked an insightful line of questions about our county's, administration of the vaccination or testing program. And suddenly we learned that the tests were not being administered as we were told they would be. And so
2.5 months ago.
I appreciate your oversight, and this dialogue has been challenging but necessary. So thank you. So this is a guideline, is that right?
Right.
Does it, and can we get from WSSC, what changes they will make if we go with 6%? Can we request that from them? I will say, I agree with the thrust of your approach here. As you mentioned, I'm worried that they have not received all the pandemic aid, that the county has received, and I don't think we're prepared to provide, a cash offset for WSSC. So it's just hard to get blood from a stone. But we actually set this rate in the spring. Is that right? This is the guide,
right?
Just to clarify, the limits are intended to provide guidance to WSSC Water on its budget development. It doesn't in any way impair the two councils from doing whatever they want to do in May when you take final action. The councils could approve a higher rate increase, for instance, or a lower rate increase. What it does is it provides WSSC with their guidance.
Could we ask them to do a 6% budget and bring it to us alongside, and then we'll be able to see if 6% is creating too many problems, then we can consider 7%. I am not opposed to 7% if that's what we have to do. But I want to know that it's what we have to do, actually. And so.
Right. Okay. So I'd move 6 and charge WSSC with exactly as Councilmember Reamer is saying, come back to us with specific expenditure reductions rather than unspecified ones. Answer the question about delinquent accounts in other jurisdictions, answer the question about federal and state aid. And we have time to have the dialogue with our intergovernmental relations office and our state delegation and the governor's staff, so we can make sure that they're getting all the fundings that they deserve.
I support that, and I think the way that Councilmember Reamer framed it, I associate myself with that if 7% is what is necessary to maintain the system, right, and make sure that everybody's drinking water is healthy, safe, clean, but wanting to make sure that we do our due diligence and provide the oversight necessary to see if that's the last resort. So, Mr. Chair, I would move what you just recommended.
Great. So it's been moved and seconded. All those in favor, just raise your hand, I guess. That's 3. Okay. Keith, I think we're good. Can you write that up?
Next steps, I will reach out to my Prince George's counterparts, and we'll see if we can, if we're coming to agreement. If we are, we may schedule council review for this Tuesday, or perhaps the following Tuesday. But we'll keep the committee posted on the Prince George's Council's actions going forward.
Great.
Can I ask for a clarification on what time frame? Typically, we will transmit our preliminary proposed budget to the counties in the middle of January. So that's when, we would, between now and then, that's when we're going to be working on how would we live within a 6% increase? What would that mean, or could we? So is that the time frame you're thinking about, seeing what a 6% budget would look like, or within the time frame of your deliberations on the spending control limits?
I think we're going to pass the spending limit at 6 and ask you to come back and justify why you might need more in time to build that into the budget. Okay. Yeah, I think that's the answer. Right.
And I think that the public hearing draft is what Mr. Beach was talking about. You also have obviously the final transmittal by March 1st.
Right.
But yeah, if we'll have to see where the two councils are, but I don't know how soon WSSC Water would have that information. They'd have to have their public hearing draft basically done before they would know what's in and what's out. So it may, I don't know if it would be much sooner than that January 15th period of time. But we'll work with WSSC Water.
That's what we'll work with. We can certainly get the question of federal and state aid. And we should have representatives from the right partners here for the next discussion, but we can certainly get that answered long before January.
Yeah, hopefully with some of your follow-up questions, yes.
Right. And the question about delinquent accounts. Okay. Thank you all so much. We appreciate everything you're doing. We're glad our water is safe, and keep up the good work. We'll talk to you again soon.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Keith.
Thanks.